Everyone, welcome to Groundwater Talk Live. I am Tom Ballard, the Groundwater Guy, and today we are talking about transboundary aquifers with Dr. Rosario Sanchez, who is joining us here shortly. We are expect her on. And I will bring her on in just a minute. But first, before we get going, we like to comment, and share. It helps us get the word out there. So I respond to all comments, and we appreciate any comments during the show too. So let's get going here. Let me bring Dr. Sanchez on, and
Tom, can you hear me? I cannot hear you. Um, I cannot hear. Let me see. Is it you or is it me? Because I cannot hear you. Let me see what's in here. Let me see. Can you speak? No, I cannot hear you. It's in my end. Let me see. Doesn't seem to be on my end. What do I do? Do. Let me. Where are you? I'm gonna hang up and get him back, okay? Just in case. No, I cannot hear you. I definitely cannot hear you. But I don't think it's on my end. I was just in a meeting and everything was working fine. Let me see. Is there something here? Okay, hold on. Predetermined. Done. Can you speak? No. Can I hear you? No, I lost you. Okay. No, hold on. Can you, Tom? Can you hear me? I heard you, and then you got lost. Um,
oh, okay. How about now?
okay, much better.
All right.
Okay.
Let us Something, yeah. So I made some adjustments here. So let me get going on this. Just repeat this. Dr. Rosario Sanchez is senior scientist at Texas Water Resources Institute in College Station, Texas. She has a PhD in water management from Texas A&M University. She is principal investigator of the Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Program for the state of Texas and director of the Permanent Forum of Binational Waters. So, an impressive resume. And I am so glad we were able to have you on, and we've got our sound issues worked out. So, it's always something when you live stream, it seems like. So I appreciate you coming on, and let's dive in here. So I guess the questions are, why do we need to care about transboundary waters and specifically transboundary aquifers? And maybe at the beginning, how do we even define what a transboundary aquifer is? So let me let you dive
Thank
in
you.
here.
Thank you, Tom. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you for the invitation. Very, very happy and glad to share some thoughts here with you and your audience. And yes, well, transboundary aquifer, let's just get simple here. An aquifer is the same everywhere. It's defined as any other aquifer. When you add the element of transboundary in it, then it becomes whatever you want to be. It depends who you're sharing it with. And it's the value that an aquifer gets when it happens to be located at the border, what makes this different. Not technically, not physically, but politically, geopolitically speaking, it takes a different meaning. So it can be whatever you want it to be um, whenever you agree to it, right? So that's how I define a transboundary aquifer. It's an aquifer as any other else, but that happens to be located at the border of two or more countries. So it requires a different meaning, a different dimension, especially geopolitical dimension. Why do we need to care about them? Well, 2 out of 5 people rely on transboundary waters today, and around 40 or so percent of the population worldwide depend on transboundary aquifers for domestic use. So, as domestic reserves are getting more and more scarce, the importance and the relevance of those shared resources across countries are getting more and more important and significant. So that's why we work on that. And just between Mexico and the U.S., which where my research is focused, we know that at least 40% of the population rely on groundwater in the border. Groundwater that is not regulated by any means.
So, what are some of the most important issues that crop up then? I mean, uh, we're dealing with transboundary issues. So I mean, the science obviously, you know, the hydrogeology, I guess, is one thing, but so really the issue comes down to management issues. Although studying an aquifer, agreeing on what an aquifer is, I mean, I just did a series of shows on hydrostratigraphy and how we define hydrostratigraphic units as opposed to geologic formations. So it's even coming to an agreement on that. But
Exactly. It
yeah, yeah, so agreeing on what the aquifer is, what the aquifer unit is, and then how do you manage it, I guess.
Yes, and that becomes interesting. That's where the challenging part is, because as I mentioned in the beginning, if you follow the definition of an aquifer according to USGS, well, that's one criteria, right? But when that aquifer is shared between two or more countries, the definition can be, three different definitions, and then you can stay there and discuss what an aquifer is forever, right? And it really depends. It really what you agree on is what makes it's really what it is. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what happened in Europe a couple of, what is it, 10 years ago. They agree on what a transboundary aquifer was. And then 2 years ago, they agree on something different. So the number changed because of that. They were up to 600 and so transboundary aquifers 10 years ago. And today, just because they decided to change the definition, they went down to 460 aquifers, transboundary aquifers or so, because now they are talking about groundwater bodies, which can or not be those hydrogeological formations, and it depends on the saturated zone. So you can get into the details and the technicalities of it, but at the end of the day, is what you really agree on, because that's what it is. Everything becomes negotiable when an aquifer is shared. Even the physical properties of the aquifer are negotiated and agreed upon the parties. So that's what makes it interesting, and therefore the management of it, because what exactly do you want to manage? Do you want to manage the unit? Do you want to manage water in the unit? Do you want to manage only those hotspots that are vulnerable? Do you want to manage just your part of the cake? Or how do you do it? And if we focus and we talk about Mexico and the US, it's very, very interesting, because it really, really gets to very, very local. um, and I think that's true everywhere, especially worldwide. Groundwater and especially transboundary aquifers are very, very local, uh, engaged. I don't want to say managed, because we are very, I mean, we are at the early stage of managing. There are no more than seven agreements out there in the world related to groundwater, shared groundwater. So it's really, and they're really diverse. It's really what you agree on. There's an agreement between Jordan and South Africa, Saudi Arabia, on the Aldisi aquifer, and they just basically, it's a 6-page agreement where they just draw a square of a hot spot on the aquifer, and that's where they focus, and that's basically it. And then
When you
there's
say
another.
hotspot, how do you define hotspot? Is that an area where you're getting overdraft going on?
In their case, that's the hot spot.
Okay, got
The
it.
area that they did, the density of wells and the drawdown where it's mostly concentrated, the overdraft of the aquifer, so they picked that. They're not dealing with the recharge area. They're not dealing with contamination. Where they're not dealing with the discharge area or anything like that. Just concentrating on where the problem is, and put some limits on the instructions. We did something like that between Mexico and the US in the Yuma Aquifer, in 1973 with minute 242. Mexico and the US decided to put some restrictions on extraction, on some limits of the aquifer, not the aquifer itself, not the management, even the management part of the aquifer. Just you can't pull more than X amount of water on this side or this side on this specific limit. That's basically it. Other agreements out there deal with sharing of information, because that's a big deal. But that's basically it.
Okay. I see you got an assistant there, a research assistant.
Okay,
so, so
keep go.
what kind
I'm
of
listening.
what kind of tools do we use for defining the hydrogeology? And I mean, we have here in the United States the GRACE satellites and monitoring, groundwater monitoring, modeling, and other satellite data. So do you use the full range of tools to kind of assess the aquifer and then use that as the basis for an international agreement?
That's the ideal, basically. But we haven't gotten that part. It's basically what we do on each side of our country's boundaries, where we are using those technologies. But really, when it comes to dealing with the other shared part of the aquifer, is you have to leverage a little bit what you have on your end and figure out what the other part will be acceptable for it. I don't think we have gone that far. I think we're still in the process of just sharing. what we have. That's as early as, it's complicated and it's challenging, but and it's really, I don't want to say we're in very naive terms right now, but it's very early stages of research at transboundary level worldwide where we are right now. And it's risky and it's very vulnerable. But that's the ideal. I mean, to be able to use all those technologies at transboundary level, at transboundary scale. Right now, we are limited within our boundaries because you have to negotiate that too, right? You have to
Right.
negotiate what technology you're going to use, what methodology you're going to use, what are the techniques acceptable for you, the parameters acceptable for you, the data that you're going to integrate, because all of those technologies require data to be able to function. So we are, we need to go back a little bit and say, okay, what is the data that you have and what is the data that you will be able to share? And we are at that stage right now. We haven't got to that far away. Um,
Yeah,
we
I always
have
say we never have enough data, but we got to work with what we got. You
exactly,
always
and then
want more data.
we always need more data when it comes to groundwater, but we need to learn, and that's for the scientific community, really, for us to face. Um, what is the minimum of the amount of data that can actually give us usable, practical results, right, for decision making? And that's a big question. What is the minimum of data that we can deal with, that we can be robust from the scientific perspective, and also be able to give some results and information and help the decision making process? That's the big question when it comes to groundwater. And that's the big question when it comes to transboundary groundwater resources, because information will always be limited between Mexico and the U.S. I mean, it's it's the everyday work that we do. It's like, what are you doing? Well, I'm trying to look for data, and it sounds simple, right? Like, that's basic stuff, right? No, it's not really basic stuff. That's where you have to deal every day to be able to produce something useful. And what can you do with that minimum amount of data? And that's the question that we have to answer every day.
On the show last week, I talked about uh, geopolitics of water in terms of surface water, and I think we understand the surface water. I mean, we looked at like, the Ethiopian area where the dam they're building in Ethiopia. We looked at, the Indus River, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, so the South Anatolia project in Turkey. So, it's a little easier to understand surface water. When you start to get into groundwater, you got many more complicating factors. And so, like you say, just even agreeing on what a hydrostratigraphic unit is across international boundaries has got to be pretty challenging. So what you're saying is really coming up with some kind of common definition before you can even dive into what you need to do to monitor the aquifer.
Exactly. And you have to pick your fights, right? That sounds like a marriage.
Always, I agree.
That sounds like a marriage advice, right? You have to pick your fights. Well, it's true here too. Where should we focus? Where should we concentrate our efforts? Where should we invest our limited resources and our limited institutional capabilities in the border when you have a problem this big? Because we know we're using groundwater, we know we're using transboundary groundwater resources more and more. We just don't know how much. We just don't know what are the vulnerabilities. We just don't know the quality. We just don't know for how long. And that's not just exclusive between Mexico and the US. That's very true all over the world. And 2 years ago, when the Transboundary Aquifers United Nations conference took place, one of the results of the conclusions was precisely that. I mean, data. Data, we're still in the process of sharing data. We're still in the process of confidence building, on institutional trust, on effective communication, on transparency, all those elements that you need on I guess, on the community based, on the scientific based community to be able to produce something at this scale. And we're not even, getting into the technical part of it, even the modeling part of it. It's challenging in a way that compared to surface water, well, we can see water, right? Groundwater is all about trust. I mean, you have to trust your models, you have to trust your scenarios, you have to trust your neighbor, you have to trust what you really can't see. So it's the trust element is a lot more important when it comes to groundwater. It's not just what the neighbor is doing on the other side, is what you are extracting and what you believe that you are extracting is affecting or not your neighbor. So, and for how long? So these human elements, social human elements, even psychological elements play a role in the management of a shared resource. So it's 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 very, very different compared to surface water, even though they're connected. And the trend right now is to look for more surface groundwater connectivity. We know they are connected, but technically, legally, institutionally, they're not necessarily connected. So how to deal with institutions that do not recognize that scientific nature, scientific truth, and at the same time, when you're dealing with those problems, how to address them within that institutional network that does not recognize it, but still needs it, right? So it's like those fights that you have to pick, right? That's a big fight that we need to pick. The recognition of surface and groundwater, not just at international level. This is true at domestic level too. So it's recognition of the nature of the natural conditions of the system, how they can help each other, how they can use each other. Because surface really, it's more, it helps groundwater, to get into this sphere of recognition of, oh, there's groundwater out there and it needs attention and it's not infinite. So that's the big fight that I like to pick.
Yeah, and you bring up a very good point, and is the relationship between surface water and groundwater. Most people don't think about that, and but the point you really made is the legal issues. We go back. I think most of our water law goes back to the mining days, back in the 1840s, where we have these legally entrenched concepts of underground rivers and stuff that don't really exist unless you're in a karst environment or something. So
Correct.
so we're dealing with a total disconnect between science and the legal side of things, and it is, so coming up with an agreement, a legal agreement, when the science doesn't agree with the law is quite challenging. So I totally understand what you're saying there, and how do you deal with that?
That's why we don't have, I guess, that's why we don't deal with it. That's why we decided to leave that to somebody else, right?
Yeah,
Um, and that's why it's a very negligent. It's complicated because it goes back to property rights, especially in the U.S. and of course Texas. And in the Mexico side, for example, is a centralized system. The water belongs to the country. So how do you deal with that? And at the international level, we don't have an agreement on transboundary aquifers. There's a draft articles of transboundary aquifers that nobody thinks is going to be ever signed. But still, there are principles out there that we can follow in the future. But as I mentioned in the beginning, this is a very local approach scale. It's a very local decision. And the successes out there, the lessons learned out there in the world tend to favor more local decisions at the scale of the aquifer itself tends to be more than even looking for because of that, because of the institutional framework or the legal framework doesn't really help much to understand what's going on in terms of groundwater at a local level and even at a transboundary level. It brings us more successes. Even, there's the formality of those efforts, and then there's the informality of those efforts. So what we have seen, according to our research and result, is that people doesn't really like to get committed legally to something when it comes to groundwater in a transboundary context, but they are willing to cooperate, they are willing to commit to something, but not at a formal level, which means it really depends, right? It really depends on the community. It really depends on the history of the aquifer. It really depends on the local conditions of the aquifer. It really depends on who your neighbor is. It really depends on what you actually want. And I'll put you a quick example. The history of cooperation on groundwater or surface water on the Rio Colorado Basin between Mexico and the U.S. is a lot more different. It has nothing to do with what we have been able to do with the Rio Grande. Nothing. It's like four different countries out there. We have a long 50 years of minutes and cooperation, and yes, and include groundwater, even the pulse flow, the release of water for the delta of the Rio Colorado. I mean, those things, they're not perfect, of course, but you don't have anything like that on the Rio Grande. Why? Because localities, history, even the history, because it's not the same history between the Colorado and the Rio Grande. I mean, it's Texas and California. It's not the same history. Plays an important role that we usually don't think about it. So the institutional, the history, the legal perspectives, all those elements are just as important and sometimes even more important than just the physical aspects of the aquifers.
So it's striking the balance. Yeah. So, which kind of leads me into my next question. And I read, a number of your papers in preparation for this interview and looked at some other ones too. On LinkedIn, there's a Transboundary Aquifer group that I kind of looked at too. But one of your colleagues, Alfonso Rivera, who he asked an interesting question in the what was it, the June 21 edition of Groundwater. When planning any type of arrangement to manage an aquifer spanning two or more jurisdictions, MOU minutes, legally binding agreements, etc., what should be managed, the aquifer or the groundwater flowing through the aquifer? So, that's an interesting distinction. And how would you kind of expand on that or explain that? Not everybody, a lot of people think of the aquifer, just the same as the water flowing through it. But as a hydrogeologist, I understand that, and you understand that. So how would you kind of expand on that, or does it even have an answer? I guess is, based on what you said, maybe it doesn't even have an answer. So
Yeah. Yes. I think that my answer will be what you really end up managing is the water users.
well, that's a good point. So
I forget about the aquifer. I forget what's inside. I mean, who are the water users? That's what you end up managing, really. And then, yes, I mean, whatever we decide, if it's the unit itself, or the water flowing through it, or the saturated zone, or it can be hotspots, it can be regional. It really doesn't matter. I think that really depends on the case of the aquifer you're talking about and the conditions of that aquifer. But what you really end up managing is the users.
okay, that's an interesting perspective, but it's probably, if you don't have the level of scientific knowledge to actually, even understand what the safe yield is in a transboundary aquifer, then all you can do is go back to the users and try to do your best guess on that. So,
Exactly, and that's the story. That's how Minute 242 was signed, which is the only agreement, I guess, between Mexico and the US that address some kind of management on an aquifer. We don't even know what the conditions of the aquifer are in that area. We don't know if it's sustainable, the level of extraction. We don't know how much water is flowing across, but we still have an agreement on what? On how much water you can actually pump. So it's a management over uses and over users on the aquifer because there's not enough. I mean, it wasn't enough data back then. We still don't have much data. 40, what, 50 years later, we're still in the same condition on that aquifer, but we know that we cannot pump more than X or Y. So
okay.
it ended up being an agreement on water users.
So the how much you pump is, or your goal for pumping, I guess you're trying to get corral all the users together. The goal for pumping, overall pumping, is kind of based on a swag, I guess. For lack of a better term. I know we probably don't want to call it completely a swag. There's some science there, but the human
Yeah.
factor is and political factor is really does enter into these things. You're absolutely right on that.
Yeah, I mean, there was so much pressure from the Mexico side on the salinity levels on groundwater. I mean, on surface water, because it was related to surface water, the problem. And how to solve that? That they say, okay, let's not pump that much water because that will help, increase the salinity levels of that. But that all was a result of the social pressure of a lot of lobbying on the Mexico side, on the presidents back then, and all of those elements that got into place in the right time at the right moment, and they were able to do it without, I mean, or with very, very limited knowledge on what the conditions of the aquifer was. So it's a very, very good example on how you can actually do something with very little amount of information, but you need to do something, right? There's no other option. So I guess it's possible now we have more information, initial assessments on the conditions. We know where could be, potential for development of groundwater. We know where issues are. We don't have that certainty, of course, that we all like on science, but we have ideas, right? We have ideas of where we should focus our attention. So from that perspective, I mean, we have much more now, and we have more, I guess, certainty on how the conditions could be in the future if we continue with this track. That's for sure.
I had a question here from I think you can probably see it on the screen from Daniel O'Donnell, who I know he's in Alabama, but his question is. That's not staying up there, but are there penalties for violating transboundary agreements, and who polices this?
Well, transboundary. I guess you meant the UN Water Convention on water, the UN Water Course Convention of 1997. It's a UN convention, so as any other agreement, international agreement, nobody really punishes them. Nobody really policies them. Policies, is that a word? I don't know if that's a word. But there are sanctions that could be established by parties, members of those agreements, and you can take those violations into the Vienna court and look for, a decision of the International Court of Justice if the country is in violation of that, and they emit their sanctions. And they cannot force you. I mean, they cannot put you in jail or anything like that. They cannot force you, military speaking, to comply with that agreement. But the fact that a UN institution has said, no, this is wrong, I mean, you have violated this agreement, doesn't look good, internationally speaking. And that's what just recently happened between Bolivia and Chile. They went to the Court of Justice. Bolivia sued Chile for a transboundary water course in that area. And the court decided in favor of Bolivia and made some recommendations. That's what they do. They make recommendations and they expect countries that are part of that convention to follow them. They don't expect that they would not do it. So it's again a lot of political negotiation, a lot of lobbying, a lot of pressure, a lot of sanctions that they can pursue. Of course, that's at the end is the decision of the country who that is being affected, or or that it's been violating the agreement to decide if they want to follow or not. Really, international law it's really out there to be aspired and followed, but not really to be enforced. I mean, the international treaties or agreements do not have that power of enforcement. Has the power of recommendation. So that's where it stays.
Yeah, we see international treaties getting violated all the time, and agreements don't aren't even treaties. And international court decisions. Yeah, how do you enforce those? It's a
Exactly.
challenge. It
It gets complicated at that level.
yeah,
Yes.
and it really depends so much on the cooperation of the parties, and that's where things can go awry a little bit, I guess, or go astray. And so that's interesting. So are there any solid agreements out there anywhere on transboundary aquifers for these frameworks between countries? um, and I did look at the court decision on the Bolivia and Chile as part of prepping for the show, and it was interesting. But it got me wondering if there's any solid agreements out there that are actually workable or in place on transboundary aquifer systems. Um, I couldn't find anything in my research, but admittedly, it was not exhaustive. So
Yes. The example that everybody likes to name because it's the only one, I guess, that covers that scale of management at transboundary level is the Genovese aquifer between Switzerland and France. It was really it's the example that everybody uses. It's been very successful, and you can look for it. And they just renew it. I think this was 10 years ago or so, 5 years ago, because it started in the 70s and they just renew it. And that's the aquifer that everybody likes to look at. It's a small aquifer, yes, but the how it evolved into something binational is very interesting. As I mentioned, it started being local and actually it's signed between the localities, but recognized at federal level. So I guess the federal institutions do not make the decisions. The locals, the Cantonese on the French side and the province on the other side, they make the decisions on what is because they are the ones that know, right? They live there, of course. The federal governments are usually far, far away of what has going on at a local level. So that's how it works. The Saudi Arabia Jordan agreement, it's another one very recent that is working. Um, there are the one on the biggest one, the Guarani Aquifer in South America was just recently signed by the four countries. Depending on it's not really yet ready to be operationally like what are we actually going to do, but they sign it. So I guess those three agreements, and there are others out there, but it's just for sharing information, not much than that. But in terms of management itself, the Genovese aquifer, the Aldisi aquifer, and the Guarani aquifer in South America are the most recent ones, and more. I mean, the Guarani aquifer is the biggest aquifer in the world, so we are looking forward to see what happens with that aquifer out there.
I guess really you got to come up with a framework first, and then, and apply it in certain situations, modify it because all aquifers are different, and the politics vary, and then kind of work from there. And that's not to say you can't modify it and improve it over time, but you got to start somewhere with a basic framework. Is that kind of a good summary of the state of the art, I guess?
Yes, and the basic framework is there. The draft articles agreed, I guess, by the General Assembly draft articles. I mean, it's not really a treaty. It's not really nothing in terms of enforceability or recommendations or responsibility, but it delineates principles, and those principles, I mean, are pretty strong. Pretty, they do cover that important element of surface groundwater interactions, the principles of communication, the principles of reciprocity, on all those good things that all humans have to have, right, in order to have a peaceful relationship with your neighbors. All those principles are in there, and all those principles are taken by all those agreements out there, because they make sense, right? At this macro level, at a global level, the specificities, the details of that framework at that scale, at a local scale, that's what really it is up to who the parties are. And I believe that's the way the general community, the international community has understood it so far.
Okay, and there's one that cropped up a number of times looking at things out there was the Nubian sandstone aquifer, and that one seems to be a little bit contentious from what I could tell, just with the different countries involved. It's kind of a mess, Any comments on that? I probably need to look into that a little more because it looked interesting, you know, but
And it's a fossil aquifer too. Uh, it's a fossil aquifer. It's um, time is catching up on us. We are very far from where we need to be right now, considering climatic conditions, water scarcity conditions. And when you are on a severe drought, extreme drought, how can you tell those people to stop overexploiting the aquifer? And that's the big question out there. How do you monitor? How do you control? How do you enforce even some restrictions when you are 80 years away from technology, infrastructure needs, and sanitation, even sanitation, and all those. It's you have to pick, right? You have to pick your priorities, and that's why the this big huge fossil aquifer is still there and contentious, because the water is not getting more abundant, right? We are not going to get more water than there was 3,000 million years ago. That's all there is. So, and we know the Nubian stone. It's a Nubian stone. It's fossil aquifer, so it's risky, it's vulnerable. But what other options, right? Are we giving them, or do they have? So it's complicated. It's really, uh, and you cannot be just ignoring the social economical conditions of those communities, or those states out there, and their priorities. This is survival, right? It's survival. And to think about managing something means that you have to give up something. So who is going to raise their hand first? Who is going to be able to give up something, to give up water, to give up when you have that social pressure, that poverty pressure, when the low income pressure, when you have those levels of infrastructure development, when you have this infamous drought all over the world at this time. So what do you do? I mean, I don't want to be president of any of those countries. I don't even want to be a president of my own country or my own countries.
I would agree with you there. So, yeah.
Really, you have to choose, and somebody has to lose.
Well, kind of my last question here, and I probably have a follow on question at the end, but or just elaborate. We've kind of touched on it here, but the geopolitical aspect. People think of geopolitics as terms of war, and that's not really what it's all about. but just the opportunities for conflicts between water issues. We see it a lot with surface water. I mean, there's a lot of that, and probably the most recent one that comes to mind is the whole deal in Crimea, where when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and the Ukrainians shut off their water, and the first thing the Russians did was go in there and blow up the dams during in 2022 to restore water flow to Crimea. So it does become involved in conflicts. Groundwater less so because it's not quite so visible. But is there potential for geopolitical conflicts with groundwater too, or is it even happening out there? Is that so? I just had that question. So
Yeah, yes, and that is the question that always arises because we're running out of available resources, and we know that groundwater is our big savings account. What is the potential of conflict out there? I think it's I don't know. I'm an optimistic. I have to be an optimistic, knowing what we know, right? I think that water, especially shared waters, really bring people together. Especially when you know that you share that resource. I mean, unless you're in a war for something else, right? But then water resources or water infrastructure becomes like a target. But history really, and there's a lot of research on this by Aaron Wolf. History has shown us that really shared waters, this is surface water mostly, don't really have a history of conflict. On the contrary, really has an history of successes. The Israeli Palestinian history, for example, I mean, they can be on war, but they do have a water agreement working. So why? Because there's too much risk. There's just too much risk to lose. I mean, you can't afford to lose. So you either sit on the table and negotiate the best way you can, or you could lose everything. So when it comes to groundwater, the vulnerability of the systems are such that I think even the level of cooperation, the attractive part of cooperation is even bigger, higher, because of that lack of knowledge, because of that vulnerability, even because you know that surface water resources are scarcer and scarcer, and you're relying much more on groundwater and much more on shared groundwater resources. So you cannot risk to lose, or you cannot risk to be contaminated, right? So I think there's a lot more pressure towards the positive part of doing this together than to do it unilaterally. If we do it without considering your neighbor, you're at higher risk of losing than to actually negotiate and lose some, right? So I really do not think that is the other way around. So that helps prevent conflict, right? Whatever agreement you reach on, that will. I mean, and I'll give you the example close home, I guess. Mexico and U.S. on the Rio Grande. 2 years ago, Mexico was not able to deliver the amount of water that is supposed to every 5 years to the U.S. from the usual tributaries because the state of Chihuahua said no more. And then Mexico had to deal with downstream states on Mexico's side to deliver that water and comply with the treaty. What happened after that? So after that, regardless of the treaty, regardless of what the treaty says, and both countries have to comply, they got together, they developed this working group together to be able to think about the next 5 cycle because we know there's going to be problems, right? And the topic of groundwater is bringing, and we're pushing actually, is or forcing a little bit the issue of groundwater to get involved into this, because there is no other way. I mean, regardless of what the treaty says, there's just not enough water in the basin to comply with it, right? So what are we going to do? Are you going to kill me, or what, are you going to invade me? That's not going to give you more water, right? So what is the only option that we have? You have to sit and figure out a way to make it work. That's what exactly happened on the Rio Colorado Basin. There was not much water in the Hoover Dam, right? So what the US said, I'm sorry, Mexico, I know we have a treaty, but I just can't give you more water because I just don't have it. How do we do it? Okay, let's get together and figure out a plan. Otherwise, you're going to run it. I mean, you're not going to get what you want. I mean, we're going to violate the treaty. And what are you going to do? You're going to invade me, or what are you going to do? So it's more like a force against conflict from my perspective. And I think we have examples of that in the world, actually. I'm an
All right.
optimistic.
So we had a question from somebody. I really hope this was recorded. So obviously you're resonating with folks out there. So yes, it will be, and I'll tell you at the end, where to find this as far as recordings go. So this question just popped up. All right, so let's kind of wrap up, and maybe you can tell us, where your research goes, because I know you're focused on the Texas Mexican transboundary area there, and what's the focus of your research in the near term down there?
Well, now we're expanding. I mean, we've been expanding from Texas, because we need to learn what other states are doing. So we're expanding to the whole border between Mexico and the U.S. And what we're trying to do right now, it's very, of course, it has to be complicated, right?
Of course.
Yeah, I mean that's why we're here. we like we like we like complication. We're trying to identify hotspots, as I mentioned from the beginning, those vulnerable areas out there in the border where we can concentrate our efforts, funding efforts, and management efforts for the future, based on the available information we have. We did some exercise already in the Texas side, but on the Texas side, Texas Mexico side. But I think we need to go a little bit deeper on density. Like, for example, well density will let us know what could be the areas of interest, and if those could be affected at transboundary level. And for example, Arizona and Sonora, I mean, they 90% or close to 100%, they rely on groundwater these days, in both domestic and transboundary groundwater. So we are trying to figure out what are those areas that we need to focus on, and for future management assessments and management possibilities. Let's call them possibilities of management. And the same goes for Texas, because really what's going on out there is, I mean, we are, as I mentioned, we are using it more every day, more. The more we know, the more we try to attract attention to that, the better shape we'll be for the future. And that's all we got. I mean, we will not have more surface water available for future uses. We know that. Or the future growing population, and is expected to duplicate in 30 years in the border region. Where is the water going to come from? It will have to come from groundwater, and it's coming from groundwater right now. So we really need to keep pushing, and we do that through the research, and we do that through the forum as well, and touching a lot of water quality monitoring, uh, because the less water, the less quality. So it's not just where are the new water supplies, but what's going to happen with our available supplies, right? Quality. We need to invest a lot of our quality in where is that going to go in the future with those water scarcity, surface water scarcity conditions. So focusing a lot on water quality monitoring, and a lot of the third one I want to mention, a lot of stakeholder involvement on whatever we do. Whatever the projects we do, we need to get the right, not the right people. the stakeholders involved. I mean, and being part and make them part of it. And I mean, we in the forum we have a bunch of volunteering people working just because they're interested, because just because they care. And I think we have underestimated a lot the power of awareness and the power of community awareness. I mean, those people, even young professionals, even kids, we need to reach to those communities because if we want to make a change, it's not going to be us, really. I mean, I'm not that young anymore. I'm sorry to say that.
Boy,
Even
I'm not even
my
going to tell you about me, but, but
But even
yeah,
those coming generations, they need to get involved, and they want to be involved. It's
agreed,
just that there
agreed.
are not really good spaces out there to get them involved and to provide something. I mean, it's as easy as you take your cell phone, you go to the river, and you take a photo. And if if we have enough photos, enough kids doing that for a certain amount of time, you get a data set of water flow monitoring and erosion, both in the coast or in the banking parts of the rivers. Their technology is there. We just need to use it and get those communities and those audiences involved in the scientific process of doing science, right? We need to start working on socializing the science and making use. We don't have time to publish for ourselves to read it just 5, 10 people that will understand my papers. You've been through that. I mean, right? If I go back to my papers, I wouldn't even understand it myself. So we need to make sure that whatever we're producing is doing and is provoking an impact to our communities, to our young communities and kids, and get them involved because they are the ones that will be able to make the change. It's not going to be us. They are the ones, and they don't need to be involved, and they want to be involved. Actually, we need to get used to
It's their future. So, a call to action. Yeah, the youth is important. So, Dr. Sanchez, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. This has been a fascinating conversation. We could probably talk for another hour, but I want to be respectful of your time, and I really appreciate you coming on. I know we had a number of people watching, and I'll get information out. I'll tell everybody where the recording will be at. But thank you very much, and we'll be in touch. So.
Thank you, Tom. Sorry that my kid showed up. He's a water kid too, so he wanted to be involved.
Hey, that's okay. We like that. So,
Thanks for the
yeah,
invitation, Tom.
Daniel says thank you. So, yeah, we will. I'll be talking with you on LinkedIn. So, and following your stuff. You got good stuff. So, all right, thank you. All right. That is the show. Fascinating topic: geopolitics, water, transboundary aquifers. It's fascinating stuff, and we only scratched the surface with Dr. Sanchez. I really appreciate her time for coming on. Let me just tell you, if you're interested in being a guest on Groundwater Talk Live, here is the link to come on, and we'd love to have you because these conversations get fascinating. For those of you who are looking for the recording, the Groundwater Guy YouTube channel is probably the best place. I post it up on LinkedIn also, but probably all my past videos are on the Groundwater Guy YouTube channel. That's probably the best place to find them. Thank you very much, and we will do this every Thursday, 11 a.m. Central. We will see you next week.